Well, Jacqueline, let me begin by thanking you for taking the time to talk to us. Welcome to the CAD School and to the Business of Humanity program. As you know, the Business of Humanity program is really driven by the idea that a lot of the things that are important to humanity have traditionally been treated as externalities, such as, for instance, impact on the environment, economic development, etc. So in that sense, we felt that the work that you do, especially at Acumen Fund, is very much synergistic with some of those ideas. So again, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me.
You have a background in international finance and you have an MBA. So can you talk a little bit about what brought you to this line of work?
Sure. I started my career in international banking, focused primarily on Latin America in the early 80s during the financial crisis then. And while I loved banking, and I still do, really saw that there was so much vitality in the streets of Rio, so much opportunity, and yet low-income people weren't getting access to the banks. And so it was a moment for me of starting to explore what the gaps were, why there was such a credit gap, and came upon the work of Muhammad Yunus from Bangladesh and Ilabat in India. And that really led me on a journey that started with microfinance and then evolved over time into thinking that while microfinance is really important, we needed other financial instruments and approaches that would allow for real change.
Mm-hmm. The Acumen Fund is something that you started in 2001, and it seems to represent a very interesting model of taking almost a venture capital kind of a model to the development space. Can you describe that for us? What is the idea behind the Acumen Fund? How does it operate?
Sure. Well, the cornerstone idea is based on this notion of patient capital, that on the one hand, that markets alone will not solve problems of poverty. In fact, they can exacerbate the gap between rich and poor. And on the other hand, traditional charity, top-down approaches, too often create dependence and not dignity. And so patient capital is right in the middle. It's this idea that if we could think about philanthropic capital just as another form of capital and invest in entrepreneurs that are looking at low-income people as customers and not as passive recipients of charity, and leave our money for a long time, expecting at or below market returns, and supporting our investment with a lot of management assistance, that we would do a better job of bringing basic goods and services like healthcare, water, housing, energy to low-income people.
So so when you talk about patient capital, how is a fund like the Acumen Fund structured? In other words, you spent some time in Stanford. If you were to look at a typical venture capital fund in Stanford or in the Stanford area, how would that be different from, say, the Acumen Fund in terms of how it is set up, in terms of investors, in terms of investment decisions, etc.?
Well, in some ways it will look quite similar, and in other ways not. Probably the biggest difference is we tell our limited partners who give us money and they take a charitable deduction that with normal VC they get financial returns, and with Acumen Fund they get change. We don't give them their money back. What we do is invest the philanthropic money they give quite like a venture capitalist, except in entrepreneurs that are deliberately focused on people living at the bottom of the pyramid. And so these are entrepreneurs that are taking completely outsized risks in areas with poor infrastructure, government corruption, customers that might make $1, $2, $3 a day, who at the end of the day will probably have fairly low financial returns, but outsized social impact. And therefore, we need to be modeled as a nonprofit and not as a for-profit, and yet we hopefully integrate a lot of the rigor and the discipline that venture does in the private sector, because they're also dealing with entrepreneurs. And so, like them, we structure our investments, we buy parts of the companies, and we're very active in the way that we help manage those companies.
Let's talk about your funding model. And if you look at the kind of the individuals who provide the funding, And I know you prefer to call them investors as compared to donors.
Just to keep people really confused.
How are they different from the typical donor? Do you think you attract a certain kind of investors?
Oh, definitely. And very much like you would see a company progress, where you had the early adopters who then move into more mainstream. If you look at our early adopters, they typically were more entrepreneurial, risk takers. They were looking for a new kind of philanthropy, one that promised accountability and results, but was equally as determined to share with them our failures as we were our successes, and who wanted to see their philanthropic money being spent with the same level of rigor as they saw their financial assets being spent and invested. And so our investors have very limited expectations of putting their names on buildings. We don't do that. They are much more active. Some of our investors give us a lot of their time, as well as their connections. And so I think that another contribution I hope that Acumen Fund is making is that recognizing that in the marketplace of philanthropists is a growing number of people who want to use not only their financial resources, but their skills, their connections themselves to be part of the change process.
Now, you mentioned rigor a couple of times. Can you talk about an example of where you see the rigor coming in terms of the investment process?
Well, hopefully it comes in at all levels of the investment process, but an example would be our entire due diligence and investment approval process, which again looks very much like a traditional VC, except that we probably spend a little more time, and we certainly do a lot more proactive hand-holding, in that we would work with an entrepreneur, in some cases for 6 months, in a very few cases where we see seriously outsized social impact, we could be working for 2 years. Building a business plan, understanding the business model, ultimately structuring our investment so that it is fair enough that the entrepreneur really sees how much we believe in her or him, and tough enough, accountable enough, so that we are more likely to be able to attract more traditional mainstream investors down the line, because if we're going to grow this, we need different sources of capital. Once those are vetted and built, the portfolio manager will present the investment memo to an investment committee at Acumen Fund, on which sits really top guys in business from the financial sector. And that has to pass muster both on a social impact side as well as on a financial impact side, because we believe scale and sustainability must go hand in hand. I actually gave 2 investment memos to someone who runs a large private equity firm in New York City, and he told me he had read them, and I said, "So what'd you think?" And he said, "Well, I thought they were great. I kind of wanted to kick some of my own people, because the level of professionalism and rigor was so great." And so hopefully we maintain that standard. But it's certainly something that we feel is really part of the respect that's owed to the entrepreneurs as well as to our investors.
When somebody develops a business plan, and this also sort of gets into the measurement issues, how do they make a case? Probably on the social side, it's a little bit, I would think it's probably a little bit more qualitative.
Yes.
But you said that it has to be equally rigorous on the financial return side. So do they tend to use the tools that are similar to what we see in a business context? NPV and discounted cash flow?
We look at
kind of
NPV,
thing?
we look at discounted cash flow, but we weigh it against the kind of social impact that we are hypothesizing and we are assuming. So a case that might illustrate that, and also shows where we ultimately need flexibility and moral leadership that isn't bound by a specific set of guidelines, would be when I remember the investment committee looking at public-private toilets in Kenya on the one hand, and on the other hand a fairly significant manufacturing plant doing a treatment for malaria. The The public-private toilets was a buyback situation from government where the private entrepreneur needed to borrow money so that it could build toilets. At the end of a 5 to 10 year period, the government would have the option of buying back these toilets, which is a very high risk proposition, as you know. We made the assumption that if we did this right and we saw 50 or 100 public-private toilets around Kenya, that it was worth the fact that we were limiting our upside to the interest we were making on that debt, even though this was a very risky proposition. What's been fascinating is that now, a year and a half later, we have 11 of these up and running. 2,000 people a day are using them on average each. So you're at about 20 to 25,000 people a day having access to a very beautiful, dignified sanitation experience, which just hasn't existed in Kenya really ever. And so for us, that kind of investment was warranted within a portfolio. Ultimately, the portfolio, we want to at least break even. But we knew we were taking an outsized financial risk with a cap on our financial returns for a super, if you will, possibility of social impact. And so we would look at others, though, where the social impact would be good, but probably not as earth-shattering, but we might have slightly more financial returns. And hopefully, in time, the test that we give ourselves is at the end of the day, are we getting between 80% and 120% of our capital back? And are we seeing what we call category breakers, where you're bringing in new models, not only for a certain area, but hopefully regionally and internationally?
It's really giving me a sense of how you have taken the best of the business decision-making process and applied it to the field that you're working in. So these are, I see that as being very consistent with the investment orientation rather than the donor orientation that you speak about.
Thank you. And it's a learning process. I would say at the beginning, when we would structure investments, we ironically erred on the side of being generous. And we thought that was important given that we had a social mission. But what would happen is that the companies will grow to the point where we needed to bring in more traditional investors. And we had a more dysfunctional negotiation at the second stage. And so now we're much more savvy, and we come off as tougher at the beginning, but long term it is leading to much greater growth and much faster sustainability. And at the end of the day, that's what we're after.
Can you talk a little bit about the organization building aspects of it? By that I mean, what were some of the challenges that you faced in building up the Acumen Fund? For example, in the book you talk about a question that you debated internally about how would your culture be distinctive amongst nonprofits. How have you answered that question over the years?
Well, it's also continuing to evolve. We just had a conversation about it yesterday. I think what we wanted the Acumen Fund culture to be about, as distinct from some larger corporate types of entities, foundations, was that we wanted individual accountability, that if you made decisions that we wouldn't blame you, but we expected you to take responsibility for the decisions that you made, right or wrong, and we would help you make them succeed. And so far that's been successful. That we would be much tougher and hold ourselves accountable to real standards. So every 6 months we do a forced ranking of every investment we have in the portfolio. And I had seen cultures where portfolio managers fought to build empires, and so anything they had done was perfect, and what other people had done deserved to be maligned. At Acumen, that's grounds for getting fired. Instead, we expect you, the portfolio manager, to talk about the weaknesses and to rank something low if it deserves to be ranked low, because we certainly don't want to find out. We have a culture where people aren't employed forever. And when we do let people go, it's typically because there's not a fit, not because of incompetence. And so trying to be human and kind, but also know that we have real standards of excellence and we need the right people in the right jobs. And I check in with the team to say, is this okay? Is this the culture we want? And increasingly, we reaffirm that. We've recently gone through a whole values exercise. And what we decided was that we looked at lots of organizations and how they looked at their values, but that to write a string of words and say that these are our values didn't really connect with Acumen Fund's way of seeing the world, because we live in such an imperfect world. And I really believe that increasingly you have to have the moral courage to hold contradictory values simultaneously. I gave the example of generosity and accountability in the way that we structure our investments. And in some ways, those are the two that we probably use the most. But also listening and leadership, that we really listen to our customers, we really listen to the stakeholders. But there are also moments when you just have to lead and take really unpopular decisions. And then humility and audacity, where we really know that we're part of a journey that takes many, many people to succeed. But we have to be audacious to believe that we will change the world, and we will. And then underlying it is the only absolute that we have, which is respect and integrity. Respect for who we are, who the people in our teams are, our customers, and our investors. All of the stakeholders. Can we live in the way that we do the work in a way that honors the dignity of the people with whom we work, in the same way as we're telling the world we need to honor the dignity of the poor that we're serving. And so every Monday we have a discussion at the end of our Monday morning meetings where we talk about values and action. We reflect on moments of the week that often have a spiritual component of, we call them, the aha moments. And I think that reinforces that a bit what the Sufi philosopher Rumi says, that you should, may the beauty of what you love be what you do. There are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the floor. That can we really be tough and focused and ambitious, but not forget that underlying it is a very spiritual belief in our ability to help make the world we want to live in.
Thank you. If you take a typical MBA student today, what is the reason that they should be aware of models like the Acumen Fund model? Why should they pay attention to the space that organizations like yours works in?
Well, first of all, I think that young people are pushing all of us to be more aware of these kinds of models, that there's a real sea change with young people saying there's got to be a better way. But having just gone through the financial crisis, where we saw so many of our leaders fail, not because they were breaking the law, but because they were not doing the right thing, and they were justifying it because it was inside the lines of the law. We need to change that approach in the way that we build leaders who understand the level of privilege that we have. And anyone who's going to a business school in this country, or frankly anywhere around the world, is a person of privilege and access. That privilege and that access must come with it a real sense of responsibility and duty to doing the right thing. And so looking at these kinds of models that start pushing on conventional wisdom of the way that we look at capital, the way that we evaluate success, needs to be part of the curriculum, because as the world gets more and more connected, we need models not just of efficiency, but models that allow us to live in a more holistic way, in models that release the energies of all human beings. And I would start with the business schools, because it needs a different kind of management, one that is more inclusive, and isn't really that different than the skills that young people are being taught today, but that is amplified with ethics, with leadership, what it means to solve problems that go beyond an individual corporation, what it means for corporations to be citizens.
Yeah. No, I think that's really a very valuable lesson. And as you were speaking at lunch, you mentioned again this trade-off between efficiency and equity. And in some ways, that's really at the middle of all of these things that you are talking about. Has the current crisis affected your funding climate or investment climate at all?
Oh yes, on both sides. On the funding climate, I would say that the same we've actually increased the number of people who've given us support this year, but they give at lower levels. And so we're really looking globally, and we're looking at young people. Today we just started our first retail program asking young people to contribute whatever they can. And on the investment side, we've seen both individual companies strain, particularly under the lack of access to credit and other forms of capital, but also in some cases, and certainly one case, a wayward politician trying to solve his problem of constituents worried that they weren't making any money, and he literally sold them certificates that absolved them of their loan obligations to a bank that we support in Pakistan. And so, as you can imagine, that turned a lot of things upside down, and the bank has been tremendous in going through a turnaround, but certainly precipitated by economics that moved into politics in a way that teaches you how dependent we are on those systems functioning more effectively together.
Well, finally, Jacqueline, what's next for Acumen Fund and for you?
Well, first and foremost is making sure our portfolio is continually stronger, and that we have real examples of what we call these category breakers, where we're seeing new approaches, proven approaches of delivering emergency services, maternal health care services, drip irrigation, delivery of clean, safe drinking water to the poor. So doubling down on our processes that enable our portfolio to be strong, grow the portfolio to 100 million over the next 3 to 5 years. And then, in some ways it's most challenging for me personally, is from the work that we do, what are the critical and key insights, the breakthrough insights, if you will, that we can then share with other entrepreneurs who are doing this in other countries, policymakers who are looking at different ways of spending aid money, or in some cases that are connected to the actual sectors in which we're working, corporations that want to get more involved with the bottom of the pyramid, so that we take the nuggets of the work that we're doing changing lives and really become more effective in changing minds. Because at the end of the day, what we're ultimately trying to do is turn upside down the development paradigm, and rather than focus on thinking we have the answers, we know the solutions, start with looking at the poor as vibrant, full-bodied human beings that want to participate in their own decisions, be part of their own problem solving, and build solutions from that perspective. And when we do that, not only does it mean we have to look at the poor in very different ways and recognize that we are them and they are us, but that we will hopefully be much more sustainable as a world, much more productive as the world, by extending the global economy to include every one of us on the planet.
I wish you all the best in that, and all the best with the very valuable work that you're doing at the Acumen Fund. And thank you again for visiting us at the Business of Humanity project.
Well, thank you, and I wish you great luck. It sounds like such an important and wonderful project.
Thank you.